Hey everybody, today we're kicking off a brand new series where we're going to build a free identity operations lab from scratch using nothing but Python, Flask, and a small local database called SQLite. By the end of this episode, you will have the foundation of a real identity tool running on your own computer, ready to be turned into something useful in the parts that follow. However, before I get into what that tool actually does, I want to talk a little bit about how this series is going to run, because this is going to be different than what you normally see from me. The difference is that this is going to be a Tuesday bonus series, which means a new part will drop every other Tuesday until the whole thing is finished. That way, my regular one off Friday content can kind of keep coming on its normal schedule. And if you're into something a little more long form, this series is going to be here for you to follow along with on the side. Now, as for why I wanted to make this series in the first place, the answer comes down to one, someone asked, and two, how the topic of identity tends to get treated out in the wild. Now, identity is one of those areas of cybersecurity and IAM where the ideas themselves are usually pretty approachable. The barrier is almost always tooling because most enterprise identity platforms keep their inner workings tucked behind paid licenses and locked down dashboards. Because of that, a lot of people kind of end up assuming this whole topic is a lot more complicated or way more unapproachable than it actually is. So basically, the goal of the series is just to rebuild that logic ourselves out in the open across 5 episodes. But before we get into structuring anything or writing code or any of that stuff, I want to walk you through the 5 episodes so you can kind of see what this series is going to look like and decide for yourself if this is something you want to watch. Now, here is what it's going to look like. The series is broken down into 5 parts, and they do really need to be watched in order because of how each one builds on the last. Today is part 2, which is the foundation, and it is where we get the project itself stood up and running on your machine. Part 2 is where the app actually learns how to read HR data, which we'll talk about later, and figure out what changed between one snapshot of the company and the next. Part 3 is where things kind of get interesting because that is where the system starts handing out and taking away access based on what's detected in part 2. Part 4 is where the system goes back and double checks its own work to make sure nothing has drifted out of line. And part 5 is where we're basically going to pull this whole thing together into a clean walkthrough of the finished product from start to finish. Now, the reason I'm making such a big deal about the order is that each one of those steps is directly built on top of the one before it, and none of them really work well in isolation. So think about it like this: you cannot detect changes in HR data if there's no foundation underneath the app to run the detection on. You cannot hand out access if the system has not figured out what changed yet. And you definitely cannot review access that was never assigned in the first place. So every part of the series depends on the one before it, which is why we are starting all the way at the bottom of the stack today. So before we start making sense of any of our files, though, we kind of need to understand the concept that this whole lab is really built on. That concept is identity operations. At its core, identity operations is the work of keeping user accounts in sync with what's happening to real people. Every time someone's status at a company shifts in any way, the account side of things has to shift right along with it, or the whole system kind of falls out of alignment, which raises a pretty important question. If the accounts have to react to what's happening to real people, then who is actually keeping track of any of that in the first place? Here's the part that most beginners, and most people in the field sometimes don't realize, is that the system that knows the most about those changes is almost never IT. It's always HR, all right? HR records the new hire before IT ever creates an account for them. HR records the termination before anyone in IT thinks to disable the login because someone's going to go to HR first to tell them that they're quitting before they go to IT to tell them to remove access. That is why, in the world of identity, we describe the HR system as a source of truth. It just means that the system we use for our HR stuff is just the system we trust the most when we want to know who's working here and what they do. That's all that means. Basically, starting the lab with the HR files is just how we're going to put that idea into practice from the very first step. Boop. Now, once you accept HR as the starting point, a pretty cool thing kind of falls out of it, which is what the diagram on the screen is kind of showing. The HR data comes in at the top, and from there, the app reads it, compares it to what it already knows, and figures out who is new, who's moved, and who's left. The steps further down the diagram are things that are going to happen later in the series. So access gets assigned, problems get reviewed, and the results kind of get displayed on the browser. The whole point of this picture here is really just that everything further down is a reaction to the one thing at the top. One reliable trigger and the rest of the system flows down from it. That is the entire idea behind automated identity work. And across the rest of today, we are going to be building only the very top of that pipeline. Now, that very top of the pipeline is what I like to call the shell. By the end of this episode, you will have a Flask app running locally on your machine, a database that sets itself up the first time you launch the app, two sample HR files sitting in the project ready for later, and 3 pages in the browser. Dashboard, upload page, and a user's page. None of those pages do anything intelligent yet, and that is completely on purpose. Today is just about getting the structure in place so you can kind of see the shape of the whole project before any of the moving parts get added to it. That way, when the actual logic shows up in part two, you already know exactly where it lives and why it lives there. Before we can stand any of that up, though, you are going to need a few things on your machine. Everything you need here is shown on the screen. On the tool side, you're going to need Python 3, VS Code as your editor, and any modern browser like Chrome or Firefox. On the project side, you're going to need the lab kit I put together for you, plus the install command shown on the screen, which is what brings Flask into the project. That is the whole setup, okay? No containers, no cloud accounts, no paid tools, nothing extra to sign up for. Once that install command finishes, you're basically just going to have a folder project ready to open in VS Code, which is where the fun starts. Now, when you open that folder up, you will see the structure shown on the screen. Let me walk you through it. The app.py file is the top brain of the project. Okay, that is where the Flask lives and where the routes for the pages are defined. The data folder is where the database file lives, along with the two sample HR files that I mentioned earlier, HR before and HR after. Those two files basically become really important in part two. The template folder is basically where the HTML pages live, which are what your browser actually displays, and the static folder holds the style sheet that controls how those pages look. You do not need to memorize any of this right now. Okay, as long as you have a rough idea of where things live and you can kind of understand the structure of this, you're in good shape. The most important question is how all of these pieces actually work together once the app is running. That is what this slide is about, all right? There are 4 pieces that make up the app, and you can kind of see them laid out on the screen. Each one has a specific job, and they pass information from one to the next in a pretty clean line. Flask is the part that gives you an actual web app. It is what turns the Python code into something you can open up in a browser. SQLite is the database, and that is where the app remembers anything between runs. The CSV files act as our pretend HR system, standing in for what would normally be a real export from a tool like Workday or Bamboo HR. And finally, the browser is just how you and I look at all of it on the screen. So once we have a source data, a place to process it, a place to store it, and a place to view it, that is the entire architecture. Out of those 4 pieces, the database is the one I want to slow down on for a second because it does have something interesting on its own that you should know about before we move on. The database in this lab basically sets itself up for you. Now, the kit does ship with an empty database file already in the project folder, so you don't have to create it from scratch. But that file starts out completely empty. The first time you launch the app, the function shown on the screen runs one time. Look inside that file, sees that there are no tables yet, and add them in automatically for you. Beauty. What that means in practice is that you never actually have to touch the database manually. You launch the app and the structure is already there waiting for you. If something ever gets weird later, you can delete the file, restart the app, and everything rebuilds from scratch. So with that out of the way, let me show you that startup function actually creates inside the file. It creates 3 tables, which you can see listed on the screen. And each one is a specific job inside the system, basically. The first one is called users, and that is where the actual employee records will live once we start processing HR data. It is the main table in the whole project, and right now it is sitting completely empty, which is what we want. Okay. The second one is called ingestion runs. Ingestion is just a fancy word for data coming into the system. So this table works like a logbook. Every time you upload an HR file later on, the system writes a quick note in here recording what happened and which file it was. The third table is called audit logs. And this one keeps track of every action the system ends up taking. So when the system creates a user, updates a record, or disables an account in a later part, all of that gets written down here. We are setting this table up early because real identity tools have to keep this kind of history for compliance reasons. And it's easier to bake the habit in from day one than to bolt it on later. So the short version is that one table is for people, one is for uploads, and one is for actions. All three of them are sitting empty right now, waiting for us to give them something to work with. The thing they are waiting for is the data inside two of those HR files I keep mentioning. All right. The first file is called HR before, and it represents the company at one moment in time with 9 employees in it, all of them active. The second one is called HR after, and it represents that same company at a slightly different moment, where there are now 10 employees and a few things have kind of shifted around. When you upload the first file, the system reads everything in it and saves the state of those employees into the users table. We call that the baseline because it is what we are going to measure against later. When you upload the second file, the system compares the new employees to the ones already saved and it picks out every difference. That comparison between the two files is what the entire engine in part two is going to be built around. And the difference between those two files is not random at all. They're real world cases that I picked on purpose to teach specific things. There are 5 people in total in this sample data, as you can see. 3 of them are the ones that matter for this lab, so I'm going to kind of introduce them one at a time. The first one is Maya Patel. Maya only shows up in the second file, which means she did not exist anywhere in the system before. That makes her our new hire example. The second one is Jordan Lee. Jordan shows up in both files, but in the second file, their department has changed and so has their manager. That makes Jordan our role transfer example, which is one of the trickier scenarios in identity work because it involves removing old access and granting new access. The third one is Chris Wong. Chris also shows up in both files, but in the second file, their status has gone from active to terminated. That makes Chris our termination example, and in the real world, terminations are the highest stake event because access has to come off quickly. Those 3 are the ones to watch out for as we go forward. The other 2 names in the data, Alex and Sam, are placeholders for things that we're going to get into later episodes. So just make a mental note of them for now, and we will come back to them later. With those people in mind, they need somewhere in the app to actually show up. That is what the 3 pages on screen are for. The dashboard is the home base. It is the first thing you land on when you open the app. The upload page is where HR data comes into the system. So when you get to part 2, that is where that's the page where you will be uploading the HR before and the HR after too. And the users page is where the records end up after the system processes them. So once everything is wired together, the users page is the one you will spend the most time looking at. So let me show you the upload page first, since that is where the data flow kind of begins. If you click on the upload page right now, you will see a file input and submit button on the screen. You can actually pick a file and click the button, but instead of processing anything, the app just shows you a message letting you know that real processing is coming in part 2. The whole reason this page exists in part 1 is so that you can kind of see where HR data will be eventually entering the system. Once that data has its way in, the next question is where does it come back out? Where it comes back out is the users page. Right now, the page is completely empty and it is supposed to be that way. There is no parser yet, no comparison logic yet, and no records to show, but this is the page I want you to keep your eye on the most because next time when the engine is hooked up, this is where you're going to watch Maya appear as a new hire, where you will see Jordan's department finally update and where Chris will get marked as terminated. The page goes from completely empty in this episode to full of real activity in the next one. That contrast is honestly the cleanest summary of what part 1 is all about. So, before we wrap up, here are the 4 ideas that I want you to walk away with. First, identity work is driven by people joining, moving, and leaving the organization. Second, HR is the most reliable source of information about those changes, which is why we use it as our starting point. 3, The way you spot changes in an HR feed is by comparing two snapshots of it side by side. And four, the app we built today is the shell that all of that activity is going to run through in the upcoming episodes. If those four ideas feel solid in your head, you are in great shape. The only thing left is to make sure that the version of the lab on your machine actually matches what we just walked through. So here is a quick gut check you can run. Your starter project should be downloaded. The app should launch into your browser without errors. The dashboard should load. The database file should be sitting in the data folder, and both the upload page and the users page should open. And both HR files should be in the sample folder. If all of those things check out for you, your foundation is in good shape and you are exactly where you need to be heading into the next episode. In part two, we're going to be adding the logic that turns this shell into something that actually responds to data, as we said before. And we're going to upload HR before to set the baseline, then HR after to trigger the comparison. And the app is basically going to start picking out the new hires, the transfers, and the terminations on its own. That is the moment when all of the empty tables and empty pages from today start filling up with real activity. Between now and then, there are a few things you can do to make sure you're ready when we get there. Everything you need is shown in the screen and linked down in the description. Please grab the lab kit, get it running on your machine, and spend a little time clicking around inside the project so the structure starts to feel familiar before the next time. If you hit a wall on any of it, leave me a comment below and tell me exactly where you got stuck, or even DM me because I can read those and they generally help me out when I'm making the next episode. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'm sorry if this was a really long video with a lot of content, but I hope to see you guys in part two. Have a great day.